This is lesson 15.4, part A, development of Russia. Describe and explain significant continuities and changes in the development of Russia from 1650 to 1750. I see a historical thinking skill right there, continuities and changes. There's our boy, Peter the Great. College Board topic 3.7. We've seen this before. We saw this in the last lesson. Absolutist approaches to power. Explain how absolutist forms of rule affected social and political development from 1648 to 1815. Peter the Great, quote, westernized the Russian state and society, transforming political, religious, and cultural institutions. Catherine the Great continued this process. We won't talk about her in this lesson. She comes along later. The time frame, 1680s to 1725. Place, Russia. We're also going to talk about the Ottoman Empire and the role they play during this period in European history. Well, let's say I'm trying to write an LEQ that uses, first, let's talk about comparison to analyze the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. Here's how I get my 6 points, as you know. First, I got to have my thesis. That's worth a point. I have to respond to the prompt with a historically defensible claim that establishes a line of reasoning. And this is all fancy talk for some very simple things. You've studied this. I'm actually going to begin my essay with my contextualization and get the point for that. I have to describe the broader historical context relevant to the prompt. I get 2 points for evidence. I have to support my argument with specific, relevant, supporting evidence with examples. Then my analysis and reasoning. That's worth a point. To get that point, I have to frame my entire essay using the historical reasoning skill, either comparison or causation or continuity and change over time, that the prompt is asking for. Next, if I really want that 6 point, I get my complex understanding together. I have to demonstrate a complex understanding of the historical development using evidence to either corroborate or to qualify or to modify my thesis. One of my several options for demonstrating a complex understanding is to introduce evidence that could be used to counter my thesis and then spinning it and showing why it actually supports my thesis if you look at it the right way. Here's a more visual representation of the LEQ format when you begin with contextualization, which you want to do. So you have your contextualization, and then that leads you to your thesis statement, which consists of 3 things. The prompt, you're going to respond to that prompt. You're going to stake a claim, and you're going to give a line of reasoning. And so that line of reasoning is going to convert to the topic sentences in your supporting arguments. Each one will get its own paragraph with a topic sentence, and we're going to go into that in much more detail later. You'll get much more practice, much more experience with this idea of converting your line of reasoning into topic sentences for your supporting paragraphs. So don't worry about that. This just kind of gives you a visual of the roadmap, if you will. So that line of reasoning converts to your arguments, and you can call it argument, you can call it reason, line of reasoning, you can call it evidence, and then you're going to describe it, explain it, and put an example in there that shows it. So then that's going to be your 2 supporting paragraphs. And then if you're really going for the brass ring and you want all 6 points, you're going to add a 3rd paragraph of complex understanding. What I like to do is bring in a diverse argument, or you can call it a reason, you can call it evidence, any way you want to call it, with an example to support that. And then at the very end, I'm going to conclude my essay by taking that argument and spinning it by looking at it in a way that actually turns it around and supports my original claim. And that's how I do it. Now, you might be asking, where's the historical reasoning skill box? Because that's a point. Well, you can't represent that with a box because that is an essential element that permeates and guides the entire essay. So that you can't put a box there to represent that point. But in this case, maybe I need a comparison thesis, like, for example, this one. Although there were many similarities between the developments of Russia and Eastern Europe, the differences were more significant. And remember, when we say Eastern Europe in this course, in this textbook, we're talking about places like Prussia, Poland, Austria, even, the German states. We're talking about the Bohemia, places like that. So there's a difference between Russia and Eastern Europe. Those two things are not the same in our textbook. So here are my similarities. To consolidate power, monarchs in both areas greatly expanded their borders. They forged a consensus between themselves and their high-ranking nobles at the expense of the serfs and the urban classes. And they greatly increased the size of their bureaucracies. They greatly increased the size of their militaries. And we saw that in the last lesson happening with places like Prussia and Austria. Same thing was happening in Russia as well. So those are similarities. Here are some differences between Russia and Eastern Europe. You've got geographical differences. For example, Russia straddled Europe and Asia. And Russia had a lot of Mongol influence. They had been ruled by the Mongols for 200 years. So they had a lot of Mongol influence in their styles of government, in their language, all kinds of things. Russia also had a lot of Byzantine influence. There were religious differences between Russia and Eastern Europe. Russia was an Eastern Orthodox country, whereas Eastern Europe was Catholic and Protestant. There are economic and social differences. Russia took serfdom to a whole new level. And one result of that was the Cossacks, who we will study and find out who they are. Russia even had state serfdom. You could be a serf for the Russian government. But the most significant differences were technological and cultural differences. Russia had significant campaigns to modernize and westernize. And the countries of Eastern Europe that we talked about in the last lesson, and they didn't need to do that as much. What about a continuity and change thesis? Well, we can say this. Although there were many changes in the development of Russia from 1650 to 1750, the continuities were more significant. And that's just an arbitrary choice that we're making. We're going to choose that, we're going to stake our claim, and we're going to back that up. So what are some changes to Russia over this time? Because we want to take inventory of both the changes and the continuities, particularly if we want to use one or the other to make a complex understanding paragraph and get that point. So, some changes. Number one, Russia greatly expanded its borders. Number two, Russian kings increased the sizes of their bureaucracies and their militaries. Number three, Russia had a program of modernization and westernization. And notice, these are the exact same things that we talked about just a second ago, but we're framing them differently. When we talked about these things, just a second ago, we were framing them in terms of a comparison historical thinking skill. Now we're framing these in terms of a continuities and change over time historical thinking skill. So these are the three arguments that support change over time. However, in our thesis, if you look back at that, we've chosen to claim that it was the continuities in Russia over this time that were more significant than the changes. So what continuities could we be thinking about? How about number one, Eastern Orthodoxy? That didn't change between 1650 and 1750. Also, the Romanov dynasty, that's an institution that didn't change. And number three, Russian serfdom. These are all things that stayed the same over time between 1650 and 1750. So now that we have, number one, identified our historical thinking skill, right, continuity and change over time, we're going with that. And now that we have our thesis all picked out, we're going to say it was the continuities that were more significant. Now that we have identified two or three changes, because we might want to use those, and now that we've identified two to three continuities that they're going to back up our argument, it's time to write our contextualization paragraph. And you've got some things to remember. Number one, you are already an expert at contextualization. You just don't realize it. We use contextualization naturally whenever we talk to our friends and our families. You know, if you go up to a friend and you say, hey, you'll never guess what happened to me. And they say, oh, no way. What? What happened to you? And you say, well, I was walking down the street. You're already beginning with contextualization. So to write a contextualization paragraph, pretend that you're giving the reader 2, 3, maybe 4 pieces of background to keep in mind if he or she is going to understand your essay. And gripes with 3 I's is really nothing more than an informal brainstorming tool to help you. And these are the things that I'm going to show you in a second that I came up after way more time to think than you will have when you write your essay. But if you can think of a quarter of this many things, like on the fly, that's all you're going to need. And it doesn't even have to be that much. So let's start with geography. What's some context that we can provide with regard to geography? Well, Russia's remoteness and its proximity to Asia. I mean, it's way out there. Russia's Mongol overlords had weakened and collapsed, which had created opportunities for Russian independence and expansion. The Mongols had ruled Russia for 200 years. What about religion? Well, Russia was the very seat of Eastern Orthodoxy, especially after Constantinople fell. Let's think about I as in innovations. For example, St. Petersburg, a window to the West. The innovation of putting the nobles to work. Innovations in the army, innovations in the navy, the ability to crush a Cossack revolt. What about I as in institutions? For example, the Romanov dynasty, the monarchy, that's an institution. The Eastern Orthodox Church, that's an institution. The nobility is an institution. Serfdom, that's an institution. And you can see how many of these elements are overlapping from one letter to the next. As far as isms go, well, you've got expansionism. And you also have westernization and modernization. An ism doesn't have to end with ism. Politics, P for politics. Well, there were 200 years of Mongol rule with all of the Mongolians' institutions, with all the Mongols' institutions and administrative language that influenced the Russians. Also in politics, you've got the Romanov dynasties, the czars. You've got rulers who were related by marriage to the last Byzantine ruler before the Byzantine Empire fell. And E for economics, serfdom, of course. And you've got great profits from Siberia's natural resources, for example, furs. And then finally, social. Lots to say about that. The Tsar was at the top. Then you've got the high nobles called boyars. Peasants were treated harshly in Russia, and some peasants fled to the frontiers in the east and the south to become Cossacks. That's where Cossacks come from. Russian peasants rebelled at least twice, and as a result, peasants were bound more tightly to the land, and urban dwellers were even tightly bound to their towns and their occupations. So we have our thesis, we have our evidence, we have our material for our contextualization. Now let's add some examples to our evidence. So our first piece of evidence that we had was that, number one, Russia greatly expanded its borders. Okay, let's talk about some specifics. This really began when Moscow was still under Mongol rule. And in the year 1480, Ivan III, he also called Ivan the Great, not Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Great, declared independence from the Mongols. Got a picture of him doing it right there. He married a relative of the last Byzantine emperor. And remember, the Byzantine Empire finally fell in 1453, fell to the Ottomans. Well, Ivan III had help from the boyars, high nobles, in his bid to break free of Mongol rule. Then you have Ivan the Fourth. He's Ivan the Terrible, and he continued this expansion that was begun by Ivan the Third. By 1547, Ivan the Fourth, Ivan the Terrible, took the name Tsar. That's a Russianized form of the word Caesar, or emperor. And he began conquering former Mongol territories in Asia. And in so doing, Russia expanded all the way to the Pacific by the year 1700. And then, of course, you've got Peter the Great, who ruled from 1682 to 1725. Peter the Great expanded Russia's borders in order to obtain a warm water port. That was a high priority for him. He went to war against the Ottoman Empire for a port in the city of Azov in the Black Sea. Peter failed to gain a permanent port there. In 1700, Peter went to war against Sweden to control Estonia and Latvia on the Baltic Sea, and he built the city of St. Petersburg, a warm water port on the Baltic Sea. Modernization and westernization. In 1697, Peter the Great went on a tour of Western European capitals. He was fascinated by foreign technology, and he took 250 Russian officials along with him, and that tour lasted 18 months. He wanted to learn everything. He did all kinds of things. He learned about shipbuilding, even took part in building ships himself just so he could understand it. And Peter the Great brought back over 100 foreign experts to Russia for the purpose of, number one, helping to modernize the Navy, and number two, improving Russia's infrastructure. Peter built the city of St. Petersburg, made it his new capital. The design reflected modern urban planning. It sat on the Baltic as a warm water port, and it was to be Peter's, quote, window to the West. Peter encouraged the spread of Western culture to Russia. He required nobles to shave their beards so that they would be more in Western fashion, and he required them to wear Western-styled clothes. Russian monarchs strengthened the military and the bureaucracy. The Great Northern War against Sweden from 1700 to 1721 was against a well-trained, professional Swedish army. And one could argue that Peter's campaign to modernize would not have happened without competition against Sweden. The war began with Russian defeats, especially at the Battle of Narva in 1700. But Peter resolved to modernize the army and the bureaucracy, and 9 years later, in 1709, Peter finally defeated the Swedes in the Battle of Poltava. Peter's revenge upon Sweden for early defeats came at great cost to both the nobles and the peasants of Russia. All of Russia's nobles, also called boyars, had to serve either in the military or in the civil service for life. He required that of his nobles. Peter created schools and universities, and every nobleman was required to spend 5 years there. So being a noble suddenly wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. You had to get a job. You had to get an education. Peter established a military-civilian bureaucracy, which was a meritocracy. And a meritocracy is a system where people move up based on merits, not based on who they know or how much money they have or how famous they are or how good looking they are. It's based on merit, so it's called a meritocracy. Everyone started at the bottom. People of humble origins were able to compete with nobles for government advancement based on hard work and ability. Peter's efforts were especially tough on Russian peasants, however. I mean, we talked about how it's tough on his nobility, especially tough on Russian peasants. Over 200,000 peasant soldiers were drafted into the military for life. He increased taxes on the peasants 3 times to fund the army, tripled them. Serfs were forced to work in mines and factories that supplied the army. Peter created regiments of Cossacks and mercenaries to bolster his forces. Now, let's look at these continuities. Number 1, Eastern Orthodoxy. Eastern Orthodoxy didn't change in Russia. Moscow was at the center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. The church eventually followed Russian expansion all over the rest of Asia. In 1649, laws said that non-Russian elites had to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy. The Romanov dynasty, that didn't change. That lasted 300 years. The Romanovs had a feeling of being special and destined for greatness because of their position as Russian rulers and because of Russia's Eastern Orthodoxy. Churchmen referred to Russia as Holy Russia. Russia was considered the third Rome, first Rome being Rome, Italy, second Rome being Constantinople, Russia, third Rome. And this feeling began in 1613 with Michael I, the very first Romanov Tsar, and it lasted all the way until 1917, over 300 years. And the Romanov Tsars consistently pursued state building and expansion from 1650 to 1725. But the most significant continuity of all was serfdom. Serfs did not benefit from Russia's progress, but instead continued to suffer. 25,000 to 40,000 serfs were used to build this great modern city of St. Petersburg without pay every summer. Serfs were compelled to work in factories and mines for the military, said that already. 200,000 peasants were conscripted into the modern army for life. Taxes on the peasants tripled under Peter's reign, so we talked about that already. So much for Russia. Now let's go over to 15.4 Part B, the development of the Ottoman Empire. That's also way out there, but still very much European. Describe and explain significant similarities and differences in the development of absolutism between France and the Ottoman Empire from 1453 to 1750. 1453, big banner year for the Ottomans. So let's say that I'm trying to write an LEQ that uses comparison to analyze the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And again, here's how I get my points, just the same as last time, just as a reminder. So let's look at this Ottoman Empire. So place, Ottoman Empire, time frame 1450 to 1750. And this map shows the Ottoman Empire in 1683. And the reason that 1683 is so significant in the history of the Ottoman Empire is because that is when they reached the very end of their strength. That's when they hit their maximum power and their maximum amount of territory. After that, they started to decline. So let's say we have a comparison thesis, and it goes like this. Although there were several similarities in the development of absolutism between France and the Ottoman Empire, the differences were more significant. So we're saying the differences were more significant, but we still want to take inventory of those similarities because they could come in very handy. To consolidate power, both countries, France and the Ottoman Empire, number one, greatly expanded their borders. Number two, had an absolute ruler. And number three, had large militaries and large bureaucracies. So that's our comparison thesis, but here are my differences. The differences between the Ottoman Empire and France. Number one, the Ottoman Empire had virtually no high noble class. Over in France, the king has to compete with a very large, powerful noble class. But in the Ottoman Empire, you don't. Number two, the Ottoman Empire had a non-Muslim slave corps. France didn't have anything like that. And number three, the most significant difference, was the succession of the sultan. In other words, the way that, every time a sultan died, the way that a new sultan would come into power. It's very different from the way succession worked in France. Here are my brainstorming contextualization ideas. G for geography. Well, the Ottomans began as nomads in Central Asia. They settled in Anatolia, that's modern-day Turkey. They had already conquered Constantinople and the Balkan Peninsula by 1650. Religion. They're Islamic, but relatively tolerant of Jews and Christians. They're a destination for refugees of the Inquisition and the wars of religion. However, keep in mind, who's doing a really great job of being tolerant towards other religions during this time? Who's really great at that? Nobody. So the Ottoman Empire is relatively tolerant of Jews and Christians. I for innovations, for example, incredible expansion. The succession, the method of succession they had, the harem. You can also think of the harem as an institution if you want to. I is for institutions, for example, the Sultanate, the monarchy, the Janissaries, Islam. I for isms, expansionism. That's the only one I could come up with. How about P for politics? Well, the Sultan is the absolute ruler. There's a slave corps that runs the government bureaucracy. They have a huge empire all around the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And you also have, this could come up, the jizya, which is the special tax that Jews and Christians pay. Economics. Agricultural land was the personal property of the Sultan. Peasants paid taxes directly to him. And the Ottomans controlled trade, that's very important, between Europe and the East. Socially, Sultan is on top. The slave corps had upward mobility, though, and Muslims had much higher status in their society than Christians and Jews. So some specific examples to support my similarities. Number one, like France, the Ottomans greatly expanded their borders. They took Constantinople in 1453. They invaded the Balkans. They took half of Hungary. They conquered many other Islamic kingdoms. And they turned the Mediterranean into what some people like to call a Turkish lake. Number two, both governments were absolutist monarchies. King of France, Louis XIV, was the quintessential absolute monarch as we know. And the Sultan in the Ottoman Empire was also an absolute monarch. He owned all of the agricultural land in the empire, and he was served by an army and a bureaucracy of trained slaves. Both France and the Ottoman Empire had large bureaucracies and militaries. This made Ottoman expansion possible. And the Sultan had the highly formidable military corps, the Janissaries or the Janissary Corps. And these were originally composed of non-Muslim slaves trained from childhood. A lot of times, conquered families had to then give their children to the Ottomans, much the same way that you had to give anything to your noble lords. By 1683, the use of indoctrinated slave children, however, was no longer necessary. Voluntary recruitment supplied all the numbers they needed because the Janissaries were so successful that people wanted to join the Janissaries. Some examples to support my differences. Number one, the Ottomans had no landed hereditary nobility. The Sultan personally owned all the agricultural land, so there was no noble class. The peasants paid taxes for the use of that land directly to the Sultan, not some lord or some prince that has possession of it. Number two, the slave corps. These ran the bureaucracy, served in the military. Islamic law forbade the use of fellow Muslims as slaves, so purchasing agents bought non-Muslim slaves on the borders. They taxed their Christian subjects in, let's say, 1,000 to 3,000 male children per year. These children were raised as Muslims. They were trained for fighting and for administration in the government. They had opportunities, actually, for wealth and power. And the Sultan's daughters were often married to high-ranking slaves, and many of these slaves were assigned to the fighting Janissary Corps. But the greatest difference between France and the Ottoman Empire was the succession of the Sultan. Sultans married women of the highest nobility, but the Sultan did not want the wife's family to gain too much influence, so sultans had no children by their wives, none. Instead, sultans kept concubines of lower rank, and sultans procreated only through their concubines, and each concubine could have only one male heir. So when the male son was ready, he was put in charge of an Ottoman province somewhere, and the concubine mother would go with him, and so this ensured loyalty and stability among the provinces. It also prevented civil wars. Let's talk about Suleiman, or Suleiman the Magnificent, and he ruled from 1520 to 1566. And one thing that he did that was different was he messed around with this succession system. And you're not supposed to marry any of your concubines. You're only supposed to have one male with each of them. Well, instead, he married his concubine, Hurin. He had 5 children with her. You're only supposed to have one. And her son, Selim II, inherited the throne. So that is just topsy-turvy with their normal, traditional method of succession. And Hurin herself became very powerful and very influential. The Ottoman decline after Suleiman the Magnificent. There were numerous revolts. There was a loss of international trade due to the Portuguese and Dutch exploration going around Africa and bypassing them and going directly to Asia. There was high prices, a shrinking population. The military failed to stay modern. At one point, they had been very modern, more modern than other European powers, but they had failed to adopt new technologies, and they had failed to adopt new training methods. And they wound up ceding Hungary and Transylvania to the Austrian Habsburgs, and we already learned about that in the last lesson. They failed twice to capture the Habsburg capital of Vienna.